Hunter Blake smiled the moment the coffee left his hand, certain that humiliating a stranger before the chief executive would cost him nothing. Mason Carter never raised his voice. He sat in his worn jacket, soaked through, while the cafe waited for him to apologize and disappear the way men like him often did. Instead, he folded a napkin into a small shape and slid it across the table toward Violet Langford without a word. Her smile vanished. Hunter's laughter died in his throat. Nobody understood that the worst mistake of his life had walked in wearing a stained shirt. Stay until the very end, because one small, quiet gesture will unravel a secret that will shake the entire corporation. The cafe sat on the ground floor of the Langford Global Tower in the heart of Manhattan, all glass and brushed steel, the kind of place where a cup of coffee cost more than most people made in an hour. On a gray Tuesday morning, the room filled with executives in tailored coats, junior associates clutching tablets, and a handful of investors waiting for a meeting that would decide the fate of 3 different departments. The espresso machines hissed in steady rhythm. Conversations blurred into a low corporate murmur. Nobody in that room expected the morning to end in anything but another ordinary round of small talk and rushed handshakes. Violet Langford walked in through the revolving doors with her assistant Amelia Grant, trailing a half step behind her, the way a shadow trails a person who has learned to move quickly through crowded rooms. Violet was 32 years old and already running one of the largest holding companies in the city, a position she had earned through a relentless habit of noticing things other people missed. She rarely smiled in public spaces. She watched. Every gesture, every glance exchanged between employees, every flicker of nervousness around her, she filed away for later. This morning, her eyes moved across the room out of pure habit, cataloging faces before she had even ordered her coffee. Hunter Blake arrived only minutes later, walking with the loose, confident swagger of a man who believed every room belonged to him the second he entered it. He was 38, regional director of operations, and desperate to remind Violet that he deserved a larger role in the company's future. He greeted 2 junior staffers with exaggerated warmth, made a joke loud enough for nearby tables to hear, and scanned the room for the best seat near where Violet would eventually settle. Power, to Hunter, was something performed in public. It did not exist unless someone important was watching him hold it. In the far corner of the cafe, away from the noise, sat a man nobody bothered to notice. Mason Carter was 34 years old, dressed in a faded jacket that had clearly survived several winters, his shoes worn soft at the heel. On the table in front of him sat a single black coffee and a thick folder of technical drawings, their edges curling slightly from age. He did not look up when the door opened. He did not check his reflection in the polished surface of the table. He simply turned through pages of diagrams with the quiet focus of someone used to being overlooked. To anyone passing by, Mason looked like a low-wage technician who had wandered into the wrong building. Someone waiting for a repair job rather than a man with any reason to be near a table reserved for senior staff. His phone buzzed once against the table, a gentle reminder flashing on the screen about a call he needed to make later that evening, the kind of quiet detail that hinted at a life built around someone else's bedtime and homework, though nothing about that life appeared directly in the room. He silenced the phone and returned to his folder. Whatever waited for him after work, it clearly mattered more to him than anything happening inside that cafe. Hunter noticed Mason almost immediately, mostly because Mason had chosen a table close to the reserved section where Hunter intended to make his impression on Violet. It irritated him instantly the way small inconveniences always irritated men who measured their worth by how quickly others moved out of their way. He expected Mason to glance up, recognize the situation, and relocate without being asked. When that did not happen, Hunter's expression shifted from mild annoyance into something sharper, the look of a man deciding that today, of all days, he would teach somebody a lesson about where they belonged. He approached Mason's table with a slow, theatrical stride, loud enough that a few nearby employees lowered their voices to listen. He asked, with mock politeness, whether Mason understood that this section was usually reserved for people who actually had business being there. Mason answered without raising his voice, explaining simply that he was waiting for a scheduled appointment and would be finished shortly. There was no defensiveness in his tone, no apology either, only a calm, unhurried honesty that seemed to confuse Hunter more than any argument could have. Violet, seated several tables away, glanced over for the first time, intrigued by the strange stillness in a man who was supposed to be afraid. Hunter kept pushing, his voice polite on the surface but laced with the kind of mockery designed to humiliate without technically breaking any rule of decorum. He asked Mason if he understood that a jacket like his did not exactly belong beside a table reserved for executives. A few younger employees nearby laughed quietly, not out of genuine cruelty but out of fear, the kind of laughter people offer when they want to stay on the comfortable side of someone powerful. Logan Pierce, the cafe's manager, stepped closer but hesitated, unwilling to confront a man who spent more money in this location than most of his regular customers combined. Mason still did not react with anger. He only repeated calmly that he had no intention of causing trouble. That calmness seemed to bother Hunter more than open defiance would have. He wanted fear, or at least visible discomfort, something he could point to and feel powerful about in front of Violet. Instead, Mason simply sat there, hands folded, eyes steady, behaving like a man who had weathered far worse insults than this one and found them barely worth noticing. Hunter's jaw tightened. He reached for the cup of coffee sitting near the edge of his own table, lifted it as though adjusting his grip, then twisted his wrist in a motion meant to look accidental. The coffee splashed directly across Mason's chest, soaking through his shirt and spilling onto the folder of technical drawings spread before him. The room let out a collective gasp, the sound of dozens of strangers suddenly paying attention to something they would have ignored seconds earlier. Hunter offered an apology dripping with sarcasm, suggesting that a man like Mason was probably used to getting dirty anyway. Amelia turned sharply toward Violet, waiting for some sign of intervention, some flicker of the authority everyone knew Violet carried but rarely displayed so openly. Violet remained still, though something in her expression shifted from detached observation into genuine discomfort. She did not order Hunter to stop. She did not yet understand why her instincts told her to wait instead of react. Mason rose slowly from his seat, reaching for a napkin on the table with unhurried, deliberate movements, the kind of motion that suggested thought rather than panic. Hunter assumed Mason would use it to wipe his shirt, perhaps even apologize for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. Instead, Mason looked down at the coffee staining the edge of his folder, then lifted his eyes toward Hunter with an expression so quiet it unsettled the people standing nearest to him. He said nothing threatening. He made no accusation. Yet the silence stretching between his words felt heavier than any insult Hunter had thrown at him all morning, and several onlookers later admitted they felt an inexplicable chill pass through the room at that exact moment. Hunter laughed louder, trying to mask the unease creeping into his own chest, though the sound came out thinner than before, less certain of itself. Violet studied Mason with new attention, noticing the steadiness in his hands, the lack of humiliation in his posture, the complete absence of the fear she expected from someone just publicly degraded in front of strangers. Whatever Hunter intended this scene to prove about power and humiliation, it was quietly slipping away from him, replaced by something the entire cafe was about to witness for the first time. Mason set the napkin flat against the table and folded it with 2 fingers, creasing it into a small, deliberate triangle with a diagonal line running through its center. The motion was simple, almost invisible to anyone not paying close attention, yet precise in a way that suggested practice rather than accident. He reached into the soaked folder and pulled free a small metal clip, setting it gently beside the folded napkin. Without announcing anything, he slid both objects slowly across the table toward Violet. Violet's eyes locked onto the shape the instant it stopped in front of her, and her entire posture changed, as if something cold had settled across her shoulders. Amelia leaned in, confused by the sudden tension, unable to understand what a folded napkin could possibly mean. Hunter kept smiling, though his laughter faded as he noticed Violet was no longer looking anywhere near him. She asked Mason, in a low voice barely above a whisper, where he had learned to make a signal like that. Mason answered simply that certain signals were only taught to people trained to recognize when a building was being compromised from the inside. The cafe fell into an unnatural quiet, the kind that spreads through a crowded room when everyone senses something serious has entered the conversation, even if they cannot name what it is. Violet glanced down at the folder soaking on the table and noticed for the first time a partial diagram of a secondary security layout belonging to Langford Global. Hunter's confidence cracked visibly, because that particular document was never supposed to leave the building, let alone surface in the hands of a stranger in a cafe. Mason spoke gently, almost without emotion, explaining that the coffee spilled across the page had revealed a layer of thermal ink hidden beneath the printed lines. As the liquid spread across the corner of the paper, a string of hidden characters had risen to the surface, characters that should never have existed on a document meant for public eyes. He did not point a finger at Hunter directly. He simply let his gaze rest on him for a moment longer than necessary, long enough for Violet to follow the unspoken implication on her own. She understood instantly that what looked like a humiliating accident had actually exposed evidence nobody had intended to surface, least of all the man who started this entire confrontation to prove his own importance. Logan stood frozen near the counter, and several customers began edging back from their tables, sensing that whatever this had become, it was no longer an ordinary disagreement between two strangers. The first twist of the morning had arrived quietly, almost without anyone noticing the exact second it happened. Mason was not merely the victim everyone assumed him to be when they first watched Hunter humiliate him. He had walked into that cafe already investigating something far larger than a single act of cruelty, and the very coffee meant to break him had instead handed Violet the first piece of proof she would need. Violet raised a hand and asked everyone in the immediate area to remain exactly where they were for the next few minutes, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that silenced even Hunter for a moment. Hunter recovered quickly, insisting that Violet was allowing a struggling stranger to manipulate her in front of an entire room of witnesses. Mason ignored the accusation entirely and instead asked Violet to review footage from the side entrance on the east end of the building, covering roughly the last 2 days. Hunter demanded to know how Mason could possibly know about a door most employees never even noticed. Mason answered that he had once helped design risk assessment procedures for buildings constructed in a similar style, though he offered nothing more specific than that. Amelia stepped away briefly to contact internal security, her fingers moving quickly across her phone as she relayed instructions in a tone far more urgent than usual. Violet studied Mason for a long moment before asking for his full name, something she rarely bothered asking strangers in casual settings. When he answered, "Mason Carter," something shifted behind her eyes, recognition surfacing slowly from a memory she had not accessed in years. That name had appeared once before, buried inside a sealed file connected to a security crisis that nearly destroyed a partner company nearly a decade earlier. Mason had been the quiet specialist who uncovered an internal betrayal at the heart of that company, preventing a catastrophic collapse before retreating entirely from the industry that made him briefly, dangerously visible. Hunter tried to interrupt, insisting that a real expert would never dress the way Mason did or sit quietly in a corner sipping black coffee like an ordinary laborer. Violet no longer trusted anything coming out of Hunter's mouth. She instructed Amelia to reach out immediately to Carter Reynolds, the company's longtime legal advisor, someone who had worked closely enough with the firm's history to recognize names buried deep in old records. Mason still made no attempt to advertise his own past, offering only that he had come to the cafe because he received a signal suggesting Langford Global was being undermined from somewhere inside its own walls. He mentioned, briefly and without detail, that he avoided public visibility now because he carried responsibilities at home that mattered more to him than recognition or reputation. Nothing about those responsibilities appeared directly in the conversation, only a steady undertone suggesting a life built around someone other than himself, a quiet motivation rather than a dramatic confession. Violet's posture softened slightly as she listened, her earlier suspicion slowly giving way to something closer to respect. Whatever Mason had walked away from years earlier, it clearly had not erased the instincts that made him dangerous to people hiding the truth. And Violet was beginning to understand that the man Hunter chose to humiliate that morning might be the only person in the room capable of saving her company. Sensing the danger of exposure closing in around him, Hunter shifted tactics and began attacking Mason directly with words sharpened by panic rather than confidence. He claimed Mason had smuggled falsified documents into the cafe specifically to manipulate his way closer to the chief executive, a theory that sounded desperate even as he said it aloud. A few lower-level employees nearby exchanged uncertain glances, unsure which version of events to believe as the situation spiraled further from anything resembling a normal morning. Hunter ordered building security to escort Mason outside immediately, his voice rising with an urgency that betrayed more fear than authority. Mason did not resist. He simply warned, in a calm and measured tone, that if he were removed from the cafe at that moment, a backup system on the 42nd floor would automatically erase itself within roughly 11 minutes. Violet asked how he could possibly know something so specific with such confidence. Mason explained, briefly, that someone had planted a timed deletion sequence designed to use this morning's scheduled meeting as cover, ensuring nobody would notice the erasure until long after it finished. Hunter scoffed loudly, calling the claim an outlandish fantasy meant to buy Mason more time inside the building. Mason simply looked at him and referenced a specific technical term, one that only somebody who had personally approved a falsified security contract would immediately recognize. For half a second, something flickered across Hunter's face, a flash of genuine alarm quickly buried beneath another wave of forced anger. Violet caught the flicker. She had spent years learning to read micro-expressions during board meetings, and she trusted her instincts far more than Hunter's protests. She instructed Logan to lock the cafe doors temporarily under standard safety procedure, a request that visibly unsettled him even as he complied. What had begun as an ugly, personal humiliation was rapidly transforming into something closer to a corporate confrontation playing out in real time, witnessed by strangers who had only wanted coffee before their morning meetings. Carter Reynolds arrived minutes later, summoned by Amelia's urgent call, his expression tightening the moment he recognized the man standing quietly near the soaked folder of diagrams. Carter immediately identified Mason as the specialist who had once helped 3 separate boards of directors avoid a catastrophic data collapse years earlier, a name he had assumed he would never hear mentioned again inside these walls. The room reacted with visible shock, eyes shifting rapidly between Mason's calm expression and Hunter's increasingly strained composure. Sweat had begun forming along Hunter's hairline, the unmistakable sign of a man realizing that every attempt to regain control was only tightening the trap closing in around him. The harder he struggled to discredit Mason, the more clearly his own guilt began revealing itself to everyone watching. Carter Reynolds confirmed quietly that Mason had once worked as a discreet crisis specialist, someone who built a career identifying internal betrayal hidden inside large corporations long before it surfaced publicly. Mason had stepped away from that life after a personal turning point convinced him that raising his son mattered more than chasing influence or recognition in rooms exactly like this one. Violet understood now that the man Hunter had humiliated only minutes earlier was not weak at all, but someone actively trying to avoid pulling other people into danger alongside him. Mason explained that an anonymous source had alerted him to irregular activity inside Langford Global's security procurement process, a pattern subtle enough to avoid detection unless someone specifically knew where to look. He had chosen the cafe because its layout offered a direct line of sight toward a secondary data connection running through the building, something almost nobody outside a small technical team would ever notice. The folder on the table, soaked now beyond saving, was actually a comparison between public building schematics and recent unauthorized alterations made somewhere inside the system. The coffee accident had inadvertently exposed a layer of heat-sensitive ink embedded in the page, proving that the document had been printed from a machine registered to Hunter's personal office. Hunter denied it instantly, though Mason did not bother arguing the point directly. Instead, he asked Violet to review login records from Hunter's office at exactly 17 minutes past 2 in the morning, a time when no normal business activity should have been occurring at all. Amelia pulled up the access logs on her laptop within moments and confirmed a recorded entry at precisely that hour. Hunter claimed his account credentials had been stolen, a defense that sounded thin even to the employees still uncertain about who deserved their trust in this unfolding situation. Mason pointed out that the system required biometric verification performed physically at the terminal, making remote access through a stolen password technically impossible. The room shifted again, this time decisively, as people who had laughed at Mason only an hour earlier began to understand that Hunter might not simply be a bully, but something considerably more dangerous hiding behind a confident smile and an expensive suit. Mason added that the irregular procurement pattern had been running for several months, carefully disguised inside routine maintenance invoices that nobody outside the finance department ever bothered reviewing closely. Each invoice looked ordinary on its own, a few extra charges here, a slightly inflated vendor fee there, the kind of small discrepancy easy to dismiss as clerical error. Together, though, they formed a pattern, a steady drain of resources funneled toward accounts that traced back, eventually, to Hunter's closest associates. Violet asked how long he had been quietly tracking these details before arriving at the cafe that morning. Mason admitted it had taken nearly 3 weeks of careful, anonymous verification before he felt confident enough in the pattern to act on it at all. Violet instructed her internal security team to hold their positions rather than act immediately, suspecting that someone within that very team may have already been compromised by Hunter's influence. Mason proposed a simple method of testing that suspicion. Send a deliberate false signal suggesting a copy of the sensitive data had been transferred down to the cafe itself. If Hunter had an accomplice nearby, That person would likely move quickly to either retrieve or destroy the supposed copy before anyone else noticed it existed. Violet agreed, though she insisted everything unfold inside the cafe itself, where she could maintain some control over how the situation developed. Mason used his own outdated phone, deliberately disconnected from any company network, to send a baited message through an ordinary public line. Hunter mocked the old device openly, though seconds later a phone belonging to a nearby security employee buzzed quietly against the counter. That employee glanced toward Hunter immediately, an instinctive look that lasted barely a second but spoke volumes to anyone paying close attention. Mason noticed it instantly and placed a steady hand on the table, signaling Violet without words to remain calm and avoid reacting too quickly. A man in a maintenance jacket walked through the front entrance moments later, claiming he had come to repair the espresso machine. Logan immediately stated he had called no such repair request, and the tension in the room sharpened into something almost unbearable. The man moved toward the back counter, where a secondary network connection linked directly into the building's wider system. Mason rose calmly and stepped into his path, asking simply for his work order number rather than physically blocking him. The man hesitated, fumbling for an answer that never came. Hunter, losing patience, shouted at Mason to step aside, an outburst that revealed far more about his loyalties than he likely intended. Violet watched closely as Hunter instinctively positioned himself to protect a total stranger, confirming exactly what she had begun to suspect minutes earlier. Mason reached for the same small metal clip from before and brushed it against the lid of the man's toolbox, dislodging a tiny data extraction device hidden cleverly inside it. The cafe fell into stunned silence once again, this time heavier than before, as the full scope of what had nearly happened settled over the room. The single gesture that began this entire confrontation, a folded napkin sliding quietly across a table, had grown into an intelligent, deliberate counterattack unfolding in real time. Nothing about it required raised fists or shouted threats, only patience, precision, and a willingness to let guilty people expose themselves through their own carelessness. Realizing his plan had collapsed, Hunter shifted tactics again, turning his threats toward reputation rather than data. He warned Violet that exposing this incident publicly would crash the company's stock value long before she could offer any kind of explanation to shareholders. He revealed almost carelessly in his panic that he was not acting alone, that a group of investors were already maneuvering to push Violet out of her own position entirely. Violet kept her composure outwardly, though the news clearly struck something deep and unsettling beneath her calm exterior. Mason recognized immediately that this had grown far beyond a simple theft of information into something closer to an attempted takeover of the entire company's leadership. Hunter offered a deal, let him leave quietly, and he would refrain from triggering whatever data leak he still had prepared. Mason asked calmly whether Hunter was entirely certain he still held the only key capable of locking that particular door. Hunter laughed coldly, telling Mason he was simply an outsider who did not understand how power actually worked among people at this level. Mason walked back toward the soaked papers near his original seat and lifted the damp folder once more. A new string of numbers had risen faintly across the surface, something even Hunter had failed to notice during his earlier outburst. Mason explained that the very act of throwing that coffee had inadvertently exposed a routing code leading directly to the company's backup servers. The exact trail investigators would need to trace this entire conspiracy back to its source. In other words, the humiliation meant to break Mason had instead handed everyone the map required to unravel it completely. Violet immediately ordered Carter to prepare emergency legal measures to freeze the relevant accounts before anything further could be deleted or transferred elsewhere. Hunter lunged toward the table, attempting to snatch the page away, but Logan and a nearby customer stepped in quickly enough to block his path. Mason did not strike him. He simply stepped aside with a small, practiced motion that left Hunter stumbling forward, losing his balance entirely on his own. Several people in the room exchanged glances, recognizing now that Mason's calm reflexes were not the product of luck, but of serious discipline training from somewhere in his past. Whatever Hunter had imagined this morning would become, it was no longer the simple humiliation of a stranger he believed could not fight back. Hunter still believed he held an advantage, certain that his hidden data transfer was already moving toward completion on a fixed timer he had set earlier that morning. Mason told Violet plainly that they had perhaps 3 minutes left to stop the transfer without crashing the entire system in the process. The technical team from Langford Global had not yet arrived, leaving only the people standing inside that cafe to respond before it was too late. Violet asked Mason directly what he needed in order to act. He answered simply, a glass of cold water, a dry napkin, and temporary access to the cafe's payment terminal behind the counter. Hunter burst out laughing, mocking the idea that anyone could save a major corporation using nothing more than a napkin and a cash register. Mason ignored him entirely. He pressed the napkin into the cold water and held it gently against the heat-sensitive section of the damaged folder, allowing a deeper layer of hidden markings to rise fully into view. He then typed a short sequence of commands into the cafe's payment terminal, which, unknown to almost everyone present, shared a secondary network line with the building's wider infrastructure. Violet recognized immediately what he was doing: an older emergency freeze protocol, one understood only by the very small group of engineers who had originally designed the building's security framework. The screens throughout the cafe flickered briefly. Hunter's phone lost signal entirely. The small extraction device confiscated earlier from the maintenance worker's toolbox powered down completely, its light fading into nothing. The entire secondary network running through the 42nd floor locked itself into a safe frozen state, exactly as Mason had intended. There was no dramatic struggle, no shouting, no physical confrontation of any kind, only one precise sequence of actions that brought the entire crisis to a sudden, complete stop. The cafe held its breath collectively, an unnatural stillness settling over dozens of strangers who had only minutes earlier expected an ordinary morning of coffee and small talk. Violet looked at Mason the way someone looks at a person who has just quietly saved everything they had spent years building. Hunter stood frozen near the overturned chair, finally understanding that he had lost, defeated entirely by the very man he had humiliated less than an hour earlier. There had been no need for violence, no need for theatrics, only patience and precision against a man who had mistaken cruelty for strength all along. With the system safely frozen, Carter Reynolds finally had enough time to issue an internal order preserving every piece of company data before anyone could attempt to erase it again. Amelia confirmed within minutes that dozens of falsified transactions, fabricated contracts, and unauthorized access changes traced directly back to accounts under Hunter's control. The man disguised as a maintenance worker admitted under questioning that he had been paid simply to retrieve the device and erase any trace of his presence in the building. Hunter continued denying everything, though every detail he offered contradicted the system logs already gathered by Mason and Amelia together. Violet ordered an independent security team, separate from Hunter's usual circle, to escort him out of the cafe entirely. Hunter turned toward Mason with raw resentment in his eyes, demanding to know why a man with so little should be allowed to destroy everything he had built for himself. Mason answered quietly that Hunter had destroyed his own life the moment he decided that people with less money carried less dignity. The words landed hard across the room, and several people who had laughed earlier that morning lowered their eyes, ashamed of how easily they had joined in. Logan approached Mason directly, apologizing for failing to protect a customer inside his own cafe. Mason did not make a scene out of the apology, simply noting that silence in the face of cruelty only makes that cruelty stronger. A few of the customers who had laughed earlier that morning approached Mason quietly, one by one, offering small, awkward apologies of their own. He accepted each one with the same calm courtesy he had shown throughout the entire ordeal, never once making anyone feel smaller for their earlier mistake. One young associate admitted she had laughed simply because she feared losing favor with Hunter, and Mason told her gently that fear was a poor reason to abandon basic decency, though he understood how easily it could happen inside a workplace built on hierarchy and pressure. Violet listened to these small exchanges with quiet attention, recognizing that the damage caused that morning extended well beyond data and contracts, reaching into the everyday courage of ordinary employees who had been too afraid to speak up. Violet stood before the room and offered a public apology of her own, admitting she had hesitated too long before stepping in. She acknowledged that years spent observing power from a careful distance had made her slower to act than she should have been in a moment that clearly demanded immediate intervention. Mason accepted the apology without using it as a moment of triumph. He simply gathered his soaked jacket, mentioning quietly that he still had an important call waiting for him later that evening. After Hunter had been escorted away, Violet invited Mason upstairs to her private office to discuss a possible role as an independent security advisor for Langford Global. Mason did not agree right away. He explained that he was not searching for a title, nor was he eager to return fully to a life that once cost him the peace he had worked hard to rebuild for himself and his son. Violet asked why he had bothered showing up at all if he wanted nothing to do with power or recognition. He answered that some things a person can walk away from, but they cannot stand by while someone else's life is quietly being destroyed. Violet realized then that Mason had not saved her company for money or status, but out of a principle he had carried with him long after leaving his old career behind. Amelia offered him a clean towel and a spare jacket from the office closet, but Mason accepted only the towel, explaining gently that his old jacket would be fine again once it had been washed. That small detail said more about him than any resume ever could. A quiet refusal to let comfort or wealth define his sense of self. Violet offered to compensate him fairly for the hours and the risk he had taken that morning, but Mason asked instead that the company establish a support fund for lower-level employees who had been unfairly pressured or dismissed under Hunter's influence. Violet agreed without hesitation, surprised by how little Mason wanted for himself. He also asked that Logan retrain his staff on how to handle public harassment inside the cafe, a request Logan accepted immediately, viewing it as a genuine chance to correct his earlier failure. The morning that began with public humiliation was slowly turning into something neither victory nor defeat alone could fully describe, but rather the quiet beginning of repair. Once the cafe had quieted and most of the crowd had drifted away, Violet asked Mason to sit with her for a few minutes near a window overlooking the street below. She admitted that for years she had believed coldness was the only quality that could keep her safe inside a world built around constant competition. Hunter had exploited that belief skillfully, turning her careful silence into a tool he used to pressure others without ever facing direct resistance. Mason did not judge her for any of it. He told her gently that people often mistake control for strength, when real strength usually means standing up for what is right before the moment becomes too dangerous to ignore. Violet asked whether he ever regretted leaving behind a career filled with recognition and influence. Mason looked out toward the street for a long moment before answering that he once lived a life full of reputation but very little peace. Becoming a father taught him that not every victory is worth the price it demands from the people closest to you. His son was never mentioned directly beyond that single, quiet reflection, present only as the steady reason behind everything Mason had chosen to walk away from. Violet looked at him with a deeper kind of respect now, not because of his skill, but because of the clarity with which he understood what mattered most to him. Mason agreed to help Violet investigate the remaining pieces of the conspiracy still threatening her company, but only on the condition that innocent employees be protected from public blame or media exposure. Violet accepted the condition without hesitation, recognizing that trust, once earned this honestly, was worth far more than any contract she could offer him. She admitted, almost as an afterthought, that she had spent so many years guarding herself against betrayal that she had nearly forgotten what it felt like to trust someone without calculating the risk first. Mason told her that trust built carefully, in small steps, tended to last far longer than trust given all at once out of relief or gratitude. Violet asked whether he thought she could still change the culture Hunter had spent years quietly poisoning from the inside. Mason said that culture rarely changed through speeches or new policies alone, but through the small, consistent choices leaders made when nobody important was watching them make those choices. 1 week later, Langford Global announced sweeping changes to its internal governance structure, changes that surprised industry analysts who had never seen the company move so quickly on matters of internal accountability. Hunter and several of his collaborators faced formal investigation for fraud, sabotage of company data, and abuse of executive authority. Many employees who had once been unfairly dismissed or pressured under Hunter's influence were either reinstated or offered fair compensation for what they had endured. The cafe itself adopted a new policy ensuring every customer, regardless of appearance or status, received equal and respectful treatment. Logan posted a simple internal notice for his staff, not a decorative slogan but a clear, practical commitment to accountability in how they treated the people who walked through their doors. Violet invited Mason to serve as an independent advisor, with no obligation to commit full-time, an arrangement that allowed him to protect both his privacy and his responsibilities at home. Mason accepted, understanding that this flexible role let him support the company's recovery without sacrificing the quiet life he had worked so hard to build. When he walked back into the building this time, nobody mistook him for someone who did not belong there. Those who had laughed at him weeks earlier now greeted him with a mixture of quiet embarrassment and genuine respect, an unspoken acknowledgement of how wrong their first impression had been. Mason never used that shift in attitude to settle old scores. He simply treated everyone exactly as he had before, with calm courtesy, which somehow made their earlier mockery weigh even heavier on their conscience. Violet learned to act decisively the moment she sensed injustice forming around her, rather than waiting in careful silence as she once had. Amelia became a central figure in the company's renewed security efforts, proud of the role she had played during the most chaotic morning of her career so far. Carter Reynolds personally oversaw the legal proceedings against Hunter and his collaborators, ensuring that every piece of evidence gathered that morning held up under the scrutiny of outside investigators. The process moved slower than anyone wanted, as these things usually do, but steadily, and within a few months the company emerged with a clearer, more transparent structure than it had operated under in years. Several smaller partner firms, watching from a distance, began adopting similar accountability measures of their own, citing the Langford Global incident as a turning point in how the industry quietly addressed internal corruption. The story closed several months later back inside the very same cafe where everything had begun. Mason walked in dressed as simply as ever, though this time the staff greeted him with sincere warmth rather than quiet suspicion. Violet arrived shortly afterward, no longer trailed by the large entourage that once followed her everywhere she went. She placed a folder on Mason's table, a much drier one this time, containing a final report confirming that the company's systems were secure, that every employee harmed by Hunter had received fair compensation, and that the new support fund had already begun helping its first group of workers rebuild their lives. Mason did not take much credit for any of it, saying quietly that everything had started simply because a cup of coffee landed on the wrong person at exactly the right moment. Violet smiled and corrected him gently, telling him it was never about the coffee at all, but about his choice not to answer cruelty with hatred. Mason glanced toward the counter, where Logan had framed the very napkin from that morning, keeping it as a small reminder of the lesson the entire cafe had learned that day. Nobody mentioned Hunter's name anymore, since whatever false power he once held had disappeared completely along with his career. Mason left shortly after receiving a brief private call from home, a quiet detail kept deliberately small and personal, never expanded into anything more than that simple grounding moment. Violet watched him go, understanding now that some people never need a stage or a title to change an entire room. The story ended where it began, at the same modest table where Mason had once been humiliated, now quietly remembered as the place where everything changed for the better. The lesson remained simple and lasting: never measure a person's worth by the condition of their jacket, because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding the truth that brings everyone else to a complete stop. Outside, the city moved on the way it always did, indifferent to the quiet drama that had unfolded inside one small cafe months earlier. Yet inside that building something had shifted permanently, a small culture of respect that no policy memo could have created on its own. Mason walked home that evening the same way he always did, unremarkable to anyone passing him on the street, carrying nothing more than a folded jacket and the steady, ordinary contentment of a man who had chosen the life he actually wanted.